Hello, this is Alex Burkett, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. This episode is a part of our Kitchen Side series where we pull back the curtain and show you the behind-the-scenes conversations, debates, strategies, and brainstorming sessions that we have at our agency, Omniscient Digital. In this one, we went deep on analytics. Well, not like how to find reports in Google Analytics 4 or analyze an A/B test or anything super tactical, but more so how to think analytically. And really, what it's all about is leveraging data and analytics to consistently make better decisions. We talk about how to know when to use and when not to use data, which techniques to apply in different situations, and why it's important to have an analytical and curious mindset in general, and also how to train and improve your analytical thinking. Without further ado, enjoy this episode of the Long Game Podcast. Getting 9 hours a night.
Dude, I started taking magnesium.
You get the glycinate shit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much is actually or if it's actually, but it feels like it's improving my sleep.
It does. Well, everybody's individual, but I have the Oura Ring, and the two things that have affected sleep the most are magnesium glycinate specifically, and then L-theanine.
Have you isolated that? Is it like you actually go a couple days not taking either and then you introduce them?
Yeah, well, it's more been a process of elimination because I used to take a lot more different things. But throughout the past 2 years, I've tested tart cherry juice, low dose melatonin, kiwis. Remember I told you kiwis are supposed to affect deep sleep? It didn't really impact me as much as so my problem has always been staying asleep. I get to sleep fine, but then usually it's tossing and turning and waking up at 3 a.m. And the things that have most affected that positively are the glycinate, magnesium glycinate, and the L-theanine. But yeah, I've tested a bunch of different stuff.
I used to take tart cherry juice or drink it, not take it. I used to drink it a lot when someone told me that it helps with muscle recovery. Maybe it was you.
It does. Yeah. It's really good for endurance specifically, I believe. If you're doing long distance running.
Yeah, dude, things feel really, I don't know if chaotic is the word I would use, but it just feels like there's a lot going on right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Bummer that Ali's out.
Yeah.
The show must go on. I saw you commented on the Kitchen Side Notes document on data literacy.
The data and analytical mindset has been on my mind a lot recently, particularly probably with the work I've been doing, but also working with our team and helping develop that mindset. But that's been a big thing for me. And I know you were talking about prioritization too.
I think that's probably been the most salient conversation I've had with everybody on the team the past probably month or two, including you and Ali and Sam. Even our last chat was all about sort of how we, the concept of an analytical mind is so tough to nail down because some people think about it and they're it means reporting and charts and posting chart goes up, chart goes down. But the way I think of it is much more fundamental. It's you have a curiosity and an awareness of something that leads you to ask questions and hone the right questions. And that that enables you to seek out information to maybe reduce some sense of uncertainty on that question, and then helps you make a decision. And you can kind of quantify the amount of uncertainty and make an informed decision because of that. That's to me a much broader way to describing analytical mind. But when we were talking with Sam in our leadership call last week about how we do that, not just looking at Google Analytics and being hey, this number is down. How do we triangulate a cause? But hey, there's an interesting problem in our process. What is the process by which we fix the process? And training that type of mindset. So I think it's been a really critical or salient thing among all of us lately.
Did we jump into the discussion already, or was that you us priming for the conversation? Because that was good.
There's no difference.
Okay. So yeah, I've been thinking about that too. And the way I was describing it to one of our team members is analytics or our calls with clients and reporting isn't just, hey, traffic is down. It's traffic is down. Here's what I dug into to understand. I looked at Google Search Console and clicks to see if they're going down at the same rate, or if we're losing impressions but not clicks, or vice versa. And if you see it's the same, it's like, great, well, it's going down for some reason. Is it because we lost rankings, or is it because the site's not performing in some way, or is it just seasonality? Like, we don't want to start with just seasonality. We got to actually like look at the other potential variables and maybe disqualify them before we land at that. And you just go through a process of, okay, is it losing traffic from a specific country? Is it a particular page or group of pages that's losing traffic? Or is it just everything equal across the board and you can't isolate anything? Then once you have invalidated all those hypotheses, essentially, then maybe you can actually say, like, we strongly believe this is seasonality. And as a strategist too, like, just kind of adding another layer is, it's not just being able to find that data and then telling them, it's explaining that whole thought process of, here's how we landed this conclusion. Because a smart executive or like anyone is going to be like, well, how did you get there? Like, how do I trust your thought process and your analysis unless if you actually tell me what you did to get to this conclusion?
So that's really interesting, because that opens up a bunch of different lines here, which is like, there's sort of the technical understanding and data literacy of certain concepts, which I wrote an old article about that and cover some of those. And then there's like the critical thinking mindset, which I think you're speaking to here, which is you went through a process of elimination or via negativa. So instead of just saying, I have this hypothesis, what data can I gather to support this? Thus, you're kind of cherry picking confirmation bias. You're saying, how can I disprove as many hypotheses as possible to isolate the one that seems to have some validity, which may be seasonality. Whereas I think seasonality is a really good example because we use it in this very informal way, but it's got a very technical definition. And this is where I think you do need, outside of just a mind that is critical and curious and analytical, it can help to have an idea of what tools you can use, like statistical methods, because there's like time series decomposition, which you can actually use to say this is seasonal or this is not seasonal. You can basically like decompose data time series and look at the trends over time and the growth rates and see which is like seasonality. Sorry, this is so complicated.
Yeah, I'm lost.
There's a technique you can use for this, but you don't have to get, I don't think most people are probably interested in time series decomposition. Most are probably just interested in the most likely scenario that they can use to make a better decision. And if it's to say, hey, like your traffic has dropped every summer in June, especially for the European continent, like what is Occam's razor? It's that Europe goes on vacation in the summer and therefore we're probably okay.
Yeah, I was actually texting with a friend who's a VP of marketing, and we were talking about marketing attribution just because like maybe we'll work together. And he was like, yeah, you guys are the only one who talk about not just getting traffic, but getting leads and conversions. And I'm just like, that's surprising because everyone I look at seems to have the same messaging now. He's like, no, you guys actually, like, at least from the agencies he's looked at and evaluated, we're the only one or one of the few. And he was like, if you guys can like dial in on telling your clients how to do not just how to do attribution, but like getting the reporting and everything set up to like map out to pipeline, that's amazing. And I was like, at the risk of opening up a can of worms, tell me how you think about attribution. He's like, I don't care about the multi-touch stuff. Like that stuff isn't helpful for me to make any decisions. I just want to know what's the first touch that brought them into the website? What's the last touch that got them to convert? And what's the last touch that got them to turn into a sales opportunity? He's like, that way I just know like what got them interested, or like what brought them to us, what got them interested to work with us. And that's all I need to know. Like, I don't need to know every single little step in the middle. Like maybe it's helpful for analysts for some reason, but as a VP, like I just need to know these 3 data points and that's all I care about. And I was just like, that's interesting because it's similar to what you're saying. Like, sure, there are all these ways to actually define seasonality and communicate that, but an exec they don't need to know all of that. There's going to be a level of detail they'll want, but maybe not that level. And I think a good analyst is someone who can kind of speak the business language too.
Yeah. And I'll say they don't need to know that unless they do.
Yes.
So like in many contexts, they don't, but like, because we're dealing with B2B and specifically this friend is probably sales led or some sort of maybe enterprise, like they're selling to larger companies and the sales cycle's long. So sure, like you probably don't have like a very like complicated marketing mix, but if you are a consumer packaged goods company that's running Super Bowl ads and billboards and podcast ads and digital spend, then marketing mix modeling and incremental testing is important, because then you can say, counterfactual, if we didn't run this billboard in this geographic location, what's the overall impact? And you can sort of quantify that. So that's the whole thing. It's funny, I just talked to like Usman and some of the team about this. We were talking about like some of our pillars and beliefs with our agency. And I'm like, the thing is, I don't think we have such strong beliefs. Like we're not, anti-backlink, or we're not anti-technical. Because I always see situations that come up where I'm like, technical SEO for most B2B brands doesn't matter unless it does. And I think that's like the take that I have, is knowing when to apply those things and when not to is also part of the analytical mindset. Because for most companies, your friend is rational. The rational thing to say is it's absolutely an intellectual masturbation exercise to argue among like linear attribution versus data-driven, whatever that black box Google's using now is, right? Nobody really knows. Because if you only have a couple channels working, like what you're doing like a political exercise to say which touch point of the 5 matters the most, and that's subjective anyway. So like, just say what brought them in, what converted them, or even like influence pipeline is a nice one too if you're using it for content and SEO initiatives. Like, did somebody view a white paper in the journey that led them to become an opportunity, right? I think that's actually a valid way to. It's obviously not worth 100% credit, but like it influenced it, so it's worth something, right? And like, how are you using that to make decisions? I think that's the bigger question you need to answer.
Yeah. You made me think of 2 things. Like what you're saying is we don't really have, I think we have strong beliefs loosely held. Whoever said that, I'll quote them. But I think the book, like Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, says it might have been the book, but something around like a good strategist isn't dogmatic. Is that the right word? Like they don't just strongly believe in one thing to do things. They believe like whatever's going to work is what the path they choose. Like don't like stick to your guns just because it's what you believe in.
Do you remember a while back? I think we may have said this on the podcast, but if not, we came up with the idea of we are strategists, not evangelists.
Yeah.
Which is totally backing up that statement. Because I see like the people who are evangelizing a certain thing, and I'm like, you're a hammer looking for a nail. We're trying to have a toolkit of levers that we can pull to grow regardless of the circumstance. We look at individual companies as like their own unique situation.
Yeah.
Strategists, not evangelists.
Yeah. We have a client, and they were saying like, hey, I think we should build backlinks. And I was like, actually, your domain rating is very high. I don't think you need links. And then I think they had a hypothesis internally. I was just like, okay, like, how about this? Don't sign on for a long-term like we can build links, but don't sign on for a long-term contract. But they had a really strong gut feeling really that we should do backlinks. And I kind of walked them off that for a couple months, and they came back to me with it. And I said, okay, look, I know you want to do this. What I recommend is maybe do it for 3 months. We'll see what the impact is and then actually decide. And it's hard to isolate the impact of link building. But once we finish all the link building, at the end of it, our team did some digging, did some analysis of like pages that we built links to and pages we didn't build links to, and fluctuation in rankings. And it's not the most scientific, but it's kind of hard to do that with SEO. But the conclusion we ended up coming up with is, hey, look, all your competitors are building links, almost like some of them more than you, but the links we're building for you are more authoritative. But the same competitors that are building links are the ones you keep fluctuating your rankings with. And so what the conclusion is, and the pages we built links to actually like performed a little bit better. But not anything I'd say was meaningful. But the conclusion was, link building for this company that's more mature is not an offensive play. It's not to increase rankings or accelerate rankings. It's actually to protect rankings, because all their competitors are also building links. And this isn't something we can scientifically prove, but we're like, before we were building links, rankings were fluctuating significantly more. Now you're fluctuating between positions 1 to 5 rather than like jumping to page 2 and all of a sudden back to page 1. So that was how we ended up, like, that was the conclusion we came up with. And I think based on what we presented, the client was like, yeah, that makes sense. And like, we actually want to keep building links because we're just showing up in more places. But that was just an example of we internally, like we were pushing back saying you don't need to build links, but because the client was open to testing, it seems like we might have invalidated a hypothesis and determined that actually it's probably worth doing. But again, nothing super binary, nothing binary here.
That's fascinating though, because it's like in college, I remember we studied like beer companies and talked about how they all advertise on TV. And the point of advertising on TV isn't necessarily because it's the most effective way to reach your audience. It's because they're in a prisoner's dilemma scenario in game theory, right? Because their other competitors are advertising there, they need to as well. The best case scenario would be they both opt out, right? Prisoner's dilemma. You like both kind of collaborate, right? That's the best case scenario, because then you could save money and apply it in more meaningful areas. So maybe link building for this company isn't it isn't the highest expected value. Like they could use those dollars somewhere else and that would bring more ROI. But because their competitors are doing so, they would have a loss if they didn't also. It's like they're kind of trapped into playing defensively.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like spreadsheet formula. Here's the best thing you can do. Here's the second best. Here's the third best. Link building's the fifth best, right? It's like you have to do this because if you don't, you're going to lose your rankings. Unless all your competitors also agree, let's just stop link building and do something more interesting.
It's not going to happen. Another thing that's been on my mind, kind of related, is like making decisions without having like super clear data. I mean, we're kind of doing it with ourselves where we're publishing a magazine that we announced on our last episode or a couple episodes ago. And I think this sort of kind of fits in a bucket of, hey, we know for SEO, we can't have 100% certainty with what we're doing, but we can at least try to find some correlation. And it's really refreshing to have a client be like, yes, we understand there's not 100% data here that can tell us this is the right decision, but it's a bet we're making and it seems like it's paying off. So let's continue doing it. And for us, like we're doing marketing that's not really measurable and kind of going like indexing even more on that other part of the barbell of let's go to events. Let's like just randomly email people and like checking on them, see how they're doing, just staying top of mind. Let's do this magazine. Let's do this podcast. And there's that other aspect of the non-measurable, non-attributable stuff that it keeps coming back up, because I think it's ironic that we're actually doing a good amount of those things, but we don't do these things for clients because it's not something that you can just convince someone to do. Like, I don't know if our clients are going to be convinced that they need to publish a magazine or something like that.
Right. The way I look at it is the midwit meme. We can return to the most important mental model of our time. And like when you start out, it's a journey, right? It's not like 3 different people. It's like yourself at 3 different points in time. And when you first start out, you have no idea of data or like how to apply statistics and uncertainty. You don't know what bias versus variance means. You don't know what a segment is. So you just kind of go on like what you can, which is intuition, gut feel, and creativity. You're still using data, but it's basically this unconscious form that's in your own mind, right? And then you move along this trajectory, and I've done this. So I learned about A/B testing, segmentation, Google Analytics reports, growth models. And then you hit this point where you're like this constant skeptic and you're like, oh, do we have data for it? Like what justifies this decision? If I can't model it out, it must not be data driven. And you're like frustrated and tight and wound up. And then you move along the curve and you master a lot of these concepts. You run like hundreds of A/B tests. You've built dozens of growth models. And you hit this point of epistemic humility where you realize this is like the ultimate form when you can use data and when you shouldn't use data, and you know how to tell the difference. You've hit that point in the serenity prayer. You know, it's like grant me the what is it? To change the things I can, to accept the things I can't, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's like the ultimate analytical mindset. is when you could just say, hey, like, we don't know if this works because there's no historical data that would prove it. And if there is historical data, well, that doesn't really speak to our unique situation. So let's just like do the best we can with the information we have.
Yeah, I think I found that as I get older, there are certain things that like phrases or sayings that I reflect on. I'm like, wait, that actually sort of makes like one of the phrases that came to mind is, what's that advertising saying it's like half of my budget is working, but I don't know which half or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I used to be of the mind that that's really dumb and you should be trying to optimize and understand how all of your marketing dollars are performing. But in reality, like, I mean, they probably have multi-million-dollar budgets, but even if it's kind of a smaller budget, like what's the marginal benefit of trying to get all the data that will help you understand the performance of every single dollar or cent? And maybe that's just a reality of marketing where there's going to be some percentage of it that you're just not going to be able to track. And that's life. And you, no matter what new tools are created that people will can tell you how all that is performing, it's not actually you're never actually going to figure that out.
That's a very interesting point. I just want to read this. I wrote this article on data literacy in 2020, and it just like had a bunch of concepts that I think a lot of people maybe don't know about that would be helpful as mental models. So some of them were like bias versus variance, signal versus noise, correlation versus causation, correlation versus correlation, a bunch of stuff.
Wait, what?
Okay. I'll link to the article. But one of them that you're speaking towards is what I called the utility versus precision trade-off. And this is something that when I was working in experimentation, I believe Matt Gershoff had talked to me about, sort of like the idea of getting perfect accuracy has a cost. And like there's like a utility, maybe that increases the accuracy of the data, but the cost maybe like reduces the expected value or utility of that. So the paragraph here, it's like data analysis is a method by which we attempt to reduce uncertainty and uncertainty can never be fully eliminated. Like that's the fundamental thesis. Therefore, there comes a point of diminishing marginal utility as you increase the precision of the model. So what you're saying on the 100%, clarity on your advertising spend, there's a cost that may even supersede the value of doing that, right? And you don't know whether that point is like, do we want 20% precision, 50% precision? How much of this do we want to quantify? Like that's subject to your own situation. So I follow up here and I'm like, in other words, the more data you collect or the more accurate the data matters up to a certain point. And beyond that, the value of increased data or increased data accuracy matters very little, but the cost of collecting that data or the increased precision becomes very high. So, and you could use this with like A/B testing, right? Like you can set your p-value threshold to like 0.001% and have a lot more certainty that the test you ran is valid. But that comes at the trade-off of, it's like you have a way bigger sample size and statistical power, and you may have to run it for like an incredibly long time. So then you have to balance that with like the business value of running the A/B test in the first place. Are you trying to get the perfect scientific answer? Are you like testing a drug to bring to the market that like may have side effects that hurt people? Or are you like testing a button color that like, frankly, probably doesn't matter that much if you made the wrong decision?
Well, even some of those drugs don't really go through that much extensive testing, I think. But yeah, that makes sense. And I think if there's any clients listening, I'm not saying don't try to track return on your marketing dollars, but just know that maybe there's some percentage of it you won't be able to fully get much more certainty on.
Well, that's the attribution stuff we were talking about, right? Like if you're not tracking any form of like, what is the effort we're doing? What are the results we're getting? And how do those two things connect to each other? That's foolish. So all of the people who are like, attribution models are broken, they don't work, therefore fuck them, right? Like that's like, you see that sentiment on LinkedIn sometimes. Yeah. That's obviously not the right approach. But then what is the incremental value of knowing that touch point B is worth 2% of the credit of the full conversion and touch point D is worth 27% because this like incremental testing model said so? Like, how are you using that information? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But first touch, do a first touch. First touch is great.
It's like there's on LinkedIn and just social media in general, there tends to be a binary view of a lot of things like, oh, attribution, you can't, like attribution is so tough to do, you might as well not do it. Or there's the folks who are like, there's this new attribution tool that you got to try. But the answer is always somewhere in the middle of, well, how much do I need to set up to just get what I need to make some decisions without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on this thing. And it's just like, oh, just use first and last touch on conversion points and you're good. Like that probably solves most people's challenges.
My favorite is when people in the modern year, right, the current year, reinvent something that has existed for a long time and think that it solves all of the aforementioned problems. So with attribution, a lot of people over the past probably 2 or 3 years were like, these models are broken, they over-index on paid spend, right? They're set up like it's a conspiracy to make you pay more with Google Ads or Facebook, which there's some truth to that, right?
Oh, I didn't hear about those conspiracies. Okay.
Last non-direct click, right? Like they overweight a lot of the paid conversion touch points, which is why you should maybe critically think about how you're analyzing your SEO spend, because it's not always the same direct response metrics as, say, a Google search ad. But anyway, they're like, all right, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's do self-reported attribution because that's going to show what touch point was the most salient in their mind. But then you think, all right, by the way, this is something I've been thinking about too. I told you our friend Mark used to say this about politics ideas that like are very simplistic. He's like, yeah, it makes sense if you don't think about it for longer than a few seconds.
Yeah.
So self-reported attribution, you're like, that's amazing. You're getting it exactly from the word of mouth of the person. But then you think, all right, memory is notoriously inaccurate.
Like, what did I eat this morning?
I barely remember what I did yesterday. and so sure, like maybe there's the argument that like whatever that's a benefit, not a bug, because your memory is going to pick the thing that stuck out the most. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the thing that stuck out the most is what persuaded you the most to reach out and request a demo. And then there's all kinds of junk data and like sampling bias. So the people who do give accurate answers maybe have a certain personality profile and you're not getting a bunch of data from the other people. So it's just funny when you see somebody who's like, all right, I found the silver bullet, self-reported. But like for decades, we've known that there's a bunch of problems with self-reported attribution.
Yeah. Or even when they try to be like specific, like we have self-reported attribution, it'll be like referral. I'm like, who referred you? Where'd you come from? There's just more questions. Or they'll be like, oh yeah, I found you on Reddit, or like someone recommended you. I'm like, that's still not helpful. I don't know what we're supposed to do with that data.
Yeah, exactly. So where are we at now? Analytics. It's such a weird topic. It's such a big, complex area, right? Why is this even important for what we do? Why is it important to be analytical? Isn't like the future of content and SEO creative, human?
What?
Why are we so adamant about being analytical?
At first, I thought that was a rhetorical question, and I realized you're actually looking for an answer. So for us, it's important as a business, but I guess for any SEOs or marketers, I'll just say marketers in general, it's not just to communicate impact, but also be able to dig into like why things are happening. So let's say you're pitching your leadership on doing a SEO program, content program, because there's no blogs on a website. And your VP is like, well, why do we need to do content? Like our sales team is just, we have a bunch of BDRs. We don't need content. And one, there's coming up with a case for how this is like inbound and all that. But there's also, well, what's the potential impact? I think an analyst would go and pull the data and try to figure out, well, how does my manager think about impact? How does the business think about impact? What's valuable to them? And be able to put some sort of quantifiable number, like put some number on what the potential impact might be, which allows leadership, including finance, to then be able to say, hey, we should invest in this thing over these other options that we have. And then once you actually get buy-in and do it, you need to be able to communicate what's happening and why you believe it's performing the way it is. To me, it's not just like, hey, analysts are analytical. I think any profession requires some sort of analytical thinking, whether you're a recruiter or a marketer or a salesperson. Like you got to be able to ask questions to understand why things are the way they are and then identify potential solutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's good. I think mine boils down to very similar things. And to me, like the idea of being analytical correlates so strongly with like the most important functions of the human brain / business decision maker, which is like being analytical is inherently how you become a problem solver. It from every angle, right? It helps you figure out which problem to solve because you can figure out which is maybe a bottleneck in an existing system and you can quantify the impact of fixing that. Or you can do what you were saying, which is opportunity sizing and saying like, hey, we have X constraints and Y goals. Which of options, in this vector, in this like factor, which one has the highest, like, which one is the most propitious for us at this time? Like if we want to achieve X result, then like, is SEO the distribution channel for us? Can we opportunity size SEO versus say like YouTube or paid Facebook ads, even like on a rough level? So it gives you like a parameter set for problem solving. And then obviously like once you go in to solve that problem, you can collect qualitative and quantitative data. You can do certain statistics and analytics techniques to start to reduce the uncertainty. And that flows into decision making, which is kind of the thing we do best as humans and also the thing we do worst. But it's like, if you really think about what we do, it's just a series of decisions, right? It's like we could go down path A or path B, right? Robert Frost wrote a poem about that. And which path you choose like has a whole bunch of implications. If we choose to go down path B, which is SEO, that branching logic brings us to a whole bunch of other areas. So how can we use critical thinking and analytics and data? Or can we say we can't use this and we have to just go by gut feel, but it helps me make decisions.
Yeah, and I think all this, we talked about this with Sam on a recent call. It kind of all just boils down to asking why. Like, why is this the case? And then I think a good reminder is why is not looking for just that one answer. It's looking for all the potential answers. And then like trying to disqualify which may likely to be the answer, which may not. And you might just be like, sure, this is a possibility, but what are the chances? And I guess in some cases that is, you might disqualify the wrong thing, but it's coming up with the hypotheses for answers to why, and then gathering the data to try to narrow in on like what's the likelihood to be the right answer.
Yeah.
And why can come into form of, or like analysis and asking why could even be looking at a competitor and be like, why are they doing it this way? And you can come up with all the different scenarios. It might be like, oh, they want to grow traffic, or they don't understand SEO and they decide they want to do like thought leadership from the CEO and not care about traffic, or these are the questions that their sales team is probably getting. Like you can start trying to analyze it beyond like just trying to copy them. And you might decide that actually the reasons they're doing this might not be the same reasons that we want to do it. And so you take a different strategy, but like all of it comes back to trying to understand rather than just taking at face value.
I think you're touching on something that I believe to be extremely true, which is a good analytical mindset is basically a function of asking good questions. Because in that example that you mentioned of the competitor, a really bad question might be, why aren't we doing what this competitor's doing? Right? Because then that frames it as like this FOMO experience where you're like, hey, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we ranking for this? The question leads you to a certain answer, right? Whereas like, why are they doing this gives you a little bit more curiosity to say like, I wonder what the justification is. Does this correspond with our goals? If we did the same thing, would we get the same result? And would that be desirable for us? Or could we do something different and achieve maybe an even better result than what they're achieving?
Yeah.
So it's the framing of the question that's very important.
That's a great loophole or like flaw in the point I was making. And even if someone were to say like, why aren't we doing this? The counter to that is, well, why should we do that? Like, just keep asking why? And like, I think hopefully that takes you down a rabbit hole to decide a yes or no or a probable answer. Like an example of sometimes if you get too analytical, like this happens to me sometimes where I think I developed that muscle a little too much, where I'll be sitting in a restaurant having dinner and I'm like, how many tables are here? How much do you think each table spends? How many seats are there per table? How quickly do you think they can turn around a room?
That all the time.
I bet this place makes like $800K in revenue. And then like minus all the, like how many people are working right now? I just start like trying to map out their business model in my head because that's the analytical brain I have.
Yeah.
It's like being a business owner.
Well, you just did that with me in our like office hours meeting where we were talking about Times Square billboard ads. And you said the price per like 15-second hourly some rate. And you're like, guess how much like if they maximize all their time slots, guess how much they make in a day. And I was like, well, if you multiply this, and you're like, no, just guess. This is supposed to be a fun game. You're not supposed to map this out.
Yeah, that's what I do with Lisa too, where like I'll ask the answer and she'll be like, or I'll ask a question. She's like, what about this? What about this? What about this? I'm like, oh man, this is no longer fun. I just wanted you to throw out a random answer without asking about the nuances.
That's so funny. Yeah. But back to, I want to just like say one more thing on the right questions thing, because it's just a reference that I cannot let go. Have you ever watched True Detective?
No, I don't know what it's about.
Okay. Yeah. There's 4 seasons and they have different actors in each one. It's kind of there's some element of like there's like a little supernatural element in some of these as well, but it's very, very dark, like police detective dramas. But the first season has Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson. And Matthew McConaughey's character is fascinating. He's just this like smart, but like in an obnoxious, like nihilistic way smart. Like he's just like very like, oh, there's no meaning in the universe, like the kind of guy. But anyway, he has a great quote in one of the episodes where he's getting interrogated. And he's just like, if you want to get the right answers, and he goes, start asking the right fucking questions. So I quoted that in the essay that I wrote about how to train the analytical mind. And I think that's like the macro value is really like asking the right questions. But I did want to maybe bring it down to more of a tactical level because we wanted to talk about like how to, my essay was about how to train this, right? Like that's something we're thinking through a lot is like, all right, you've got employees and you have new hires in the future. And we as a company believe in the value of this style of thinking, as well as the implementation and the reporting and the attribution. So like, how do you train not just maybe like the ideology and how to think like this, but like, do we train for particular tools? Like, how do we train this style of thinking? Is it trainable?
Honestly, I don't know.
I think that curiosity itself is probably a personality trait and probably not the most trainable thing.
I feel like I go back on this sort of question, not just for analytics, but there's the whole like nature versus nurture thing. And reflecting on myself, I for sure know that I have natural tendencies towards certain types of things or certain behaviors or certain curiosities. And I think there is a part of being an analyst where maybe some of it is inherent. Like, I think we know people who naturally ask those type of questions. And it's like, oh, this person really likes to dig deep. And then there may be some folks who are less inclined to do that. But that being said, I think, and I argue with my barber about this type of stuff all the time because that's what I do with him. But where I landed was there is an extent to which you can train certain things. We were talking about dancing. Like he's like, there are people who will never become a dancer, like ever. And I'm like, that's mean. Like I think you can train them at least a little bit. And I think for analytics, it's similar where you can give the tools, you can lead by example, you can ask them the type of questions, and over time, some folks will catch on and start asking the same types of questions, and maybe they'll start asking the same questions without fully internalizing why those questions are being asked. But maybe over time and with more experience, they'll come to understand, oh, I see why Alex would ask this question whenever this thing comes up or something.
Yeah, I have to believe that there's some trainability here because I don't think that I started my career asking the quality of questions that I ask now. I know you can train workflows. Like I know, for instance, when I started working at CXL, this was when universal analytics, GA4 is a whole new beast, obviously, but like I could be trained in how to get a report in universal analytics for the conversion rates or bounce rates or exit rates by landing page. And somebody could tell me that, hey, Google Analytics structures their data according to scopes. So the way it's collected, right, the infrastructural knowledge I need is that there's a hit, there's a session, there's a user, and then there's e-commerce. and a hit is a page view, and a page view is not a session. A session can accumulate multiple page views, and a page view cannot convert because a conversion or an event is also a hit. So those are two of the same data types. So you need to go to landing pages because that's going to be the first landing page in a session. And then you can analyze how many conversions were in that session. You can teach me that, but can you teach me the little scratch in my head, the little itch that says, I wonder if, right? Or I wonder what is happening here that would lead me to do that report on my own. That's where I'm like, I don't know, like, because there's a certain type of mind, and I think journalists and analysts have this actually both, or writers, storytellers, whatever you want to say. But I've said this before on the pod, but like, there's this masterclass with Malcolm Gladwell, and he's talking about some essay that he did for the New Yorker about why there's so many brands of mustard, but there's really just Heinz ketchup.
Yeah.
And this is because this guy walks down the grocery aisle and he wonders, why are there so many mustard brands? And like, most people don't think about that. So I think there's something maybe inherent, and I think maybe you can train that level of mindfulness, maybe that like level of awareness to notice more things. You could probably tweak that a little bit. But there is some type of personality that says, I wonder why this thing exists. And that's totally my brain. It's like, I wonder why this table is built this way. I don't.
Yeah. And I think that kind of got me thinking about, I don't think this is always the case, but in my experience, I have noticed people tend to have this, I don't know if it's the right thing to call it, but like a psychological barrier about being like a quote data person or quote being an like analyst. And I think having those titles kind of makes people think like, oh, I'm not an analyst, like, or I'm not a data scientist. I'm not great with data. It's like, those are just, analysts are not the only people who are analytical. It's just a job title where that's literally like what they focus on doing. I think everyone can be analytical and just have enough of that muscle built to be able to ask good questions. Like you're saying, like, you don't need to be an analyst, or you don't need to spend years doing the job of an analyst or a data scientist to be comfortable with data and using it to like make decisions and like build out these reports and ask good questions. I just want to make that point because I think the idea of data can seem overwhelming to people. Like, where do I start? What data do I pull? How do I use these tools? And kind of loses, I think, what the essence is of being analytical.
I'll actually bring an even stronger opinion to the table, which is, in my career, I think that many of the people who go by the title of analyst are on the lesser analytical side of the spectrum. And some people who don't have that title, to me, are much more analytical thinkers. So I don't think they even correlate very strongly. If we're talking about correlations here, there's no causality, certainly. But that mindset of like, I've met a lot of analysts who are very rigid in their thinking. They're not very scientific. If you think of the scientific method, right? They're not like, insight, hypothesis, experiment, delight. They're like, no, things are done this way. I do things by checklist. Like, I get this report because person told me to, which is totally not analytical, And I think like the idea too that you're speaking on, which is like people are afraid of data and the idea of analytics because it maybe connotes math. The math is not actually that challenging with regards to most analytics that we're doing. It's really cursory stuff. And even like when you get into more of the statistics, there's so many frameworks and tools that help you apply the mathematics at this point that, to me, like, that's the perception or maybe like the fear around it. And maybe there's some gatekeeping too, because I do think people in data science, analytics, whatever, they tend to be a little bit, they'll use really scary words and they kind of make things sound more complex than they are.
Yeah. Wasn't there an article about, I forgot, I think you might have sent it to me from the Mode founder around like firing your data scientist or something like that. Is that from you?
Yeah, that was like a really
it's kind of extreme.
He's kind of nihilistic.
Yeah.
Well, he's like, I've worked in this field for like decades, and like he's just wondering, like, is it worth it? Like, are we doing anything?
Yeah.
Are we changing anything? So I thought, I mean, that was more of, I think a lot of people have felt that in their careers. They're like, is all this work, is this Sisyphean task of building all these analytical tools when the CMO just says, hey, dude, actually, I saw this meme. We should post this in the show notes. It was like, silence, data-driven decision maker. A vibes guy is talking. But that's basically, he's the Mode founder is tired of that. He's like, we're building all this cool stuff. Like, we're getting better and better at like analyzing data and like getting the right decisions, and still nobody's listening. What the hell, I
don't think that's ever going to change. Like, there's never going to be a world where we're going to be super rational using data to make every decision. Like, that's just not. And I think that would be a really boring reality. Like, kind of loses all the magic.
That was what my prioritization essay really centered on, was like, the world is more complex than your simple spreadsheet model. And that's like I think, epistemic humility that comes from working with a lot of data, is understanding when maybe your model is too simple, or in the other context, when we were talking about attribution, when it's too complex and it should be more simple. But one example I gave in the prioritization essay was if like you're dealing with SEO, you've got traffic, volume, keyword difficulty, whatever dimensions you have. And then some opportunity comes across your plate. It's like, hey, if you pulled this data from your product, you have like a very good shot of getting on the Tim Ferriss podcast, and also speaking at this conference, and also getting like syndicated in like the New York Times and this and that. So like, none of that fits in your model because there's no search volume. There's no, like, the dimensions don't equate to like this new opportunity. And I related that to dating or marriage, right? Because a lot of people now are very quantitative or rational about what they want in a partner. And they say, here are my deal breakers. Here are the things that I want in my ideal life partner. And like, the thing is all of that falls apart as soon as you fall in love. So are you going to let your little spreadsheet model, your little list of criteria, are you going to let that supersede falling in love? The most irrational of all human behaviors.
And then you're in this weird spot where it's like, the checkboxes tell me not to be in this relationship, but I want to be.
Exactly.
Been there.
So, I mean, it's because the spreadsheet is underfit for the real world, which like your brain may have actually valued something that you couldn't have quantified before. So, I don't know, have fun, live a little,
Have fun. That's the answer.
There was one other thing I thought we could talk about with analytics, but it's probably the thing that I have thought about most over the past decade, and not like analytics, like Google Analytics reports, but like, how do we make decisions? That's like the fundamental question I've been studying through my experimentation days, any product work I've done, most marketing work. I'm like, how do we choose the right thing?
Yeah. I'm willing to bet you've thought about this a lot more than I have. And like, one of the things that I've started thinking a lot about is the styles of decision making. I think for some of us who come from startups where it's like, move fast, like you may not have all the data, but like just take the next step. Don't worry about 10 steps later or anything like that. And I've learned that there are some folks who see all the decisions that they can make. And one, that's the point of paralysis. But even after making that decision, they're still thinking about all the other decisions that could have been made. So even if you're like 10 steps down that decision you made, this person is still thinking about that first decision that led to all this. And I don't know if ruminating is the right word, but it's a very exhausting mindset. Like, I know someone who does this a lot. And for me, I'm like, made the decision, not looking back at it. Maybe in like a month or two, I'll look back and ask if it was the right decision and if I need to change anything. But in the meantime, I'm not going to think about it anymore. Like, decision is made, let's move forward. And when it comes, like, I guess data is like a tool that people hope help them do that so that they don't ever wonder if they made the right decision or not. But there are maybe some folks who are just more comfortable with like, yep, I made a call with maybe not all the information, but I'm not going to worry about that anymore.
That's why it's so important for me to remember this like fundamental thesis that I have, which is like, data is a tool to reduce uncertainty. Uncertainty will never be fully reduced. So like, you're never going to be in a perfect information state. And like, knowing that gives you, or should give you, a little bit more confidence to just commit and act. Because the other thing is that action produces feedback, which is information that can then inform you in future decisions. Very few doors are just one way. You can usually back out or iterate or improve upon what you're doing.
Yeah.
Even life partner,
Yeah.
You can change your life partner, I suppose. But, like if you don't ever make the decision, which I think a lot of companies are dealing with nowadays, it's this Buridian's donkey. It's the donkey who's sitting equal distance between food and water and cannot make up his mind. So he dies of thirst and hunger.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you sit in between all of these options and you never do anything. Your hands are tied behind your back because you simply cannot act without 100% information. So you just stall, you never invest in SEO. You never invest in paid. You just sit there, right? And by moving in one direction, you would have produced some information and you could have backed out. You could have changed and altered the course, but you did nothing instead.
Yeah. You know how in John Wick, I forgot the scene, but like John Wick says like consequences. And that's just like his one line. My one liner has been trade-offs.
Yeah.
Because every time I talk about something and someone's like, but like if I do that, I can't do this. And like trade-offs. That's it. Like doesn't mean it's the wrong decision. It just means like every decision is going to have a trade-off. And with marketing, investing in new channels, it's like the trade-off is it might not work. Like no matter what you choose, it might not work. There's no thing that is 100% going to work. And if you're okay with that, like in 3 months, if it works, great. If it doesn't work, you're kind of prepared and you're like, we capped our losses and now we can move on to the next thing that we were wondering if we should invest in, and we can open up that budget to try that out now. Granted, there's a lot of variables that go into why something might not work, but like going at that mindset and not being like, oh, it didn't work. I wish like we should have chose that other thing. Like that's just a whole different framing of the situation.
Do you ever do that in your personal life? Like I find most of the time I'm a very fast decision maker and I love novelty and I'm very comfortable with uncertainty. But sometimes I'll be wanting to watch a movie and I'll just spend like 45 minutes trying to find the perfect thing to watch. Or like DoorDash is the worst. Like I'm a guy, I don't like DoorDash. I think like I'm a person who loves to just like wander out into the street and find like an interesting looking place and just go in, which 99 out of 100 times, I'm happier with that decision than when I analyze 100 options on DoorDash. So I find that like your happiness level, I think there's been books written about this too, like the paradox of choice and whatnot. You're actually happier if you just like satisfice and you go into like an option knowing that it may not be perfect, but you're going to enjoy it fully anyway, as opposed to just sitting there trying to interrogate every option and like do pros and cons about like the best Adam Sandler movie to watch as you, sit on the couch.
What I've done is I set a time limit for myself. Like I'll tell Lisa, like, I'm going to browse DoorDash for 10 minutes, or I'm going to browse Netflix for 10 minutes. And if I can't find a show, I'll just watch the show that I already know I'm going to like. Or like I'll just order from the restaurant that I know I'm going to like. And I just limits the time that I spend. But I did that recently. I was on Amazon Prime as well, Prime Video. And there's all these new originals and shows. I'm just like, oh God, okay, there's so many options. I just chose the thing that was like popular, to be completely honest. And now I'm like, this shit works the way they organize information and make choice easier and social proof. So I'm watching Outer Range now. I would have never watched this if it didn't just randomly show up and was the easiest choice to make.
That's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down and have done many times with algorithms. But one thing, maybe I'll try to connect this too, is like this whole idea of like, you don't need perfect information. In fact, you cannot have perfect information. But you through doing something over and over again, you kind of get some fingertip feel, Fingerspitzengefühl in German. And like, so with jujitsu or like playing chess, the first time you go into it, like your mind is just like overwhelmed because there's a million things you can do and you don't know all of them and everybody else knows them. So you feel like a child. And that's probably how a lot of people feel getting into data.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I felt. Like when I worked with Pep at CXL, like he's so data driven. Like he understood every part of Google Analytics, all the A/B testing stuff, all the qualitative. And I'm like, what's a heat map, right? Like I had no idea what any of this is. And now I have a fingertip feel, especially for experimentation and statistics data. But one thing I saw is JH posted on Twitter. He said 7 years into running a business, and one skill I feel like I finally developed after way too long is being able to quickly spot metrics or logic that doesn't quite track when presented in a chart or a doc. I remember watching Jason Cohen and Heather Brunner, CEO of WP Engine, be world class at this and envying their ability to say, quote, wait, that doesn't seem right, and poke holes in a dashboard. one that I likely put together in pipeline review meetings. And I think that's been my experience. And I think we're starting to see that with some maybe business metrics and like how to read P&Ls and whatnot. But like you go in not really knowing that much, and you've got to be really comfortable with that discomfort. But through time, you end up being it's such a paradox, but you're like intuitive about analytics. So you're like blending system 1 thinking brain with system 2 thinking brain.
Yeah.
And like you'll see a chart and be like, you'll immediately see the thing, you know?
Yeah. An example for me of when I had that like childlike, I've never done this before type was learning how to use our new applicant tracking system, Ashby. Shout out to Ashby. It's like a HubSpot for recruiting. I'm like, oh, this is how people, like I've used HubSpot for years. I'm like, oh, this is how people feel when they enter a new platform like this. Like it was so bad that we hired a consultant. Shout out to Destiny Lalane. She set everything up and she communicated everything. I was like, I still don't fully understand, but I'm sure if I just poke around for a couple of days, like I'll start developing some intuition around this. But I'm feeling that firsthand. It's not a great feeling, but I'm excited to like build a new skill essentially.
Well, that's the good thing. And maybe we can cap off with this message of inspiration is that everything you learn, you go through that exact same feeling and process. What's the framework? It's like unconscious incompetence, and then conscious incompetence, you know you're bad. And then you go all the way up to the point where you're like unconsciously competent. And that's what we're talking about with the intuitiveness.
Yeah.
But anything you want to learn, you're going to feel like that in the beginning. So I think with training, maybe an analytical skill set / mindset is you're never going to get there without action. So like you kind of have to dive in and like just feel very incompetent for a while. I do think it helps to be surrounded by people who do know more than you. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you can even watch them do things and they can watch you do things and you can talk about it and like have a collaborative, like personal one-to-one kind of training session. Courses have helped, right? But you don't want to overdo that because, right, it's all theory until you're looking at the dashboard for the client that you're working with. I think that's just the nature of learning new stuff.
Hell yeah. Always be learning.
Right on.
As they say.
That's good.